Good morning. I'm John Fortier, Director of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you all for joining us today. We are here to talk about an important institution or overseer of some institutions and with a report that has been the product of a year's worth of work by, I think, some of the most expert people in the subject. Let me show you the report first. Oversight Matters, what's next for Inspectors General. This report can be coming out today, can be found on the Bipartisan Policy website, bipartisanpolicy.org. It is a report that is the product of a task force that has been meeting for a year with former Inspectors General, former members of the administration, both in cabinet positions as well as in management-oriented positions like OMB, and people who have worked on Capitol Hill in oversight positions. Now, this subject is important, I think, for our interest in institutions because it is an executive branch position, the Inspector General, that has oversight responsibilities within a department and helps ultimately, I think, keeping our departments honest and also improving their capacity to manage and govern. But it is also an institution that has responsibility to Congress and for the second, for the branch of government, the legislative branch, to oversee, to properly account for what its laws and its spending are taking place. The Inspector General is an important institution that contributes to that. So what we have today is a series of two panels, beginning with Dan Blair. Dan Blair is the leader of this task force. We have brought him to BPC to really run this work and to run much of our work on oversight, congressional oversight in particular. Dan has a background on Capitol Hill, also in the executive branch and at the National Academy of Public Administration. Dan is going to run through this report, what are the highlights, and then we're going to hear from some of the task force members, the Inspectors General, the members of Congress, the department heads, as well as those who've been engaged in congressional oversight. So with that, I'm going to turn to Dan Blair, who will lead us off in the first session.
Thank you, John. Those are very kind words. Very much appreciate that introduction, and it's been a real pleasure working with you and Matt Weil during this project. You both have brought tremendous leadership to the effort. I'm very excited about today's events. It was about a year ago at this time that I first sat down with John to discuss this project. We discussed the need for better oversight and the role that the Inspectors General play. Our task was how to enhance oversight with a deep dive into how the Inspectors General operate in this oversight framework. We formed a bipartisan task force of stellar former public administration officials with experience ranging from cabinet secretary to member of Congress to presidential appointees, former senior Hill staff, and 3 well-respected former IGs. And we recognize our work comes at a pivotal moment in IG history, since it is the 40th anniversary of the IG Act. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate our task force members, beginning with Ed DeSev. Ed can't be with us today. Arnold Fields, Dan Glickman, Jim Hughes, John McHugh, Robert Shea, Betty Lou Taylor, Dave Williams, and Denise Wilson for an outstanding job as members of this special task force on government oversight and the IGs. We had a phenomenal brain trust that put together this report, and please join me in honoring them today. And I'm going to ask you all to stand. During our meetings over this past year, we had first-class, knowledgeable speakers, and I'd like to thank them all for their contributions to the report. We started off with the Department of Justice IG and the Chair of the Council of IGs for Integrity and Efficiency, Michael Horowitz. State Department IG, Steve Lennick, DOD IG, Glenn Fine, HHS IG, Dan Levinson, and OMB's Dustin Brown. When we discussed the role of IGs, they were very direct in framing our report. IGs are an integral part of agency management, and their oversight role in reporting to Congress and the agency head give them a unique vantage point in helping shape good government and good agency management. We heard from other luminaries too, the Comptroller General, seasoned Hill staffers who knew the value or know the value of IGs, including one of our panelists today, Beth Stein with the Senate Help Committee, IGs from the small agencies, well-known academics, fellow nonprofits with a mission to assist in good government, and media who cover IGs. I'm pleased to report that our publication today, Oversight Matters, What's Next for the IGs, is formally released. Copies are available in the back of the room, and this report makes concrete, actionable recommendations to the President, Congress, agency heads, IGs, and the Council of IGs for Integrity and Efficiency. And that council provides a government-wide forum for IGs and issues that they address. This morning, we have two panels to discuss our findings and recommendations. And our first panel will be moderated by my colleague, Michael Thorning. Michael, you were essential in putting this report together, and it's been a real pleasure working with you during this time. Michael will be discussing with a select group of task force members, Dan Glickman, John McHugh, Arnie Fields, and Dave Williams, where the IGs fit into the oversight framework and offer recommendations for improvement. Our second panel will be moderated by task force member Robert Shea, and he will lead a discussion with task force members Jim Hughes and Denise Wilson, and Chief Oversight Counsel for the Minority Staff on the Senate Help Committee, Beth Stein, who is also one of our speakers earlier in the year, and Deputy State IG and former Senior Hill staffer and an expert on the IGs, Amelia DeSanto. And they're going to be discussing how to use the lessons learned from the past IG experiences to prepare IGs for success in the years ahead. Each panel will have time for audience Q&A and will be available after the program for additional questions. At this time, I would also like to recognize my colleague Natalia Johnson, who will be doing the wrap-up at the end of today's program. Michael and Natalia were tremendous partners in producing this report, and it's been my pleasure to be able to work with both of you. I also thank my BPC colleagues, Beverly Hudnut, Brennan McAfee. Brenna kept our logistics straight and our task members informed. Our intern, Joshua Farrar, Carolyn Cooper, Toby Zakaria, and the entire BPC Democracy Project team. And also a very special thank you goes to our funders, the Democracy Fund and the Hewlett Foundation, for making this event and report possible. Every morning, it seems, we wake up with another headline reporting on waste, fraud, and abuse, and what the IGs are doing to bring this to the public's attention. IGs are critical to executive branch oversight and the accountability and transparency necessary for public trust in our institutions. However, we recognize that most of their work is done outside the headlines, and developing constructive working relationships with agency management can help them and their respective department or agency address issues before they become problems that blow up and make headlines. The public good is best served by a constructive relationship between an IG and the agency. Congress created IGs not just as watchdogs to serve it in its own oversight needs, but also to assist agencies in better accomplishing their missions. We highlight in our report our observation that IGs and agency heads often keep too much distance between one another, resulting in missed opportunities to improve federal programs and operations. Agency heads tend to be wary of the IGs, fearing that their work may lead to an embarrassing report. And some IGs maintain excessive distance between themselves and the agency to bolster their independence. It's time for a culture shift. IGs need to be brought more into the fold of the management of the agencies while also respecting IG independence. They must have a seat at the agency table. This doesn't compromise their independence. On the contrary, it gives IGs insight into current agency priorities and activities and allows for IGs to be proactive in flagging issues that come to their attention, rather than waiting for problems to develop and claim credit for investigating them later. Congress has a role to play. It needs to support IGs and the council overseeing them. They need to engage IGs more in informal ways outside the public hearing process and use the IG's work when they develop their oversight plans. And IGs can better engage Congress by making themselves and their staff more publicly accessible. And the IGs are evolving as an institution. We found the Council of IGs, otherwise known as SIGI, has made great progress since its inception 10 years ago. The focus on cross-cutting issues that span departmental and agency lines is welcomed and will continue to grow as our government tackles difficult policy choices that cross departmental jurisdictions. And we endorse efforts to give SIGI a dedicated funding stream, and in our report, we recommend some ways to do it. We note the number of vacancies in IG positions and urge the President to move promptly in nominating qualified candidates to fill vacancies, and urge the Senate to do its constitutional advice and consent on a timely basis. Our report goes into much greater detail, and to discuss these recommendations, I would now like to turn over the program to our first panel to be moderated by Michael Thorning. Good morning, Michael, and welcome to our task force members who will be joining him.
I'd like to get started by thanking Dan, who provided tremendous leadership and direction to this effort. Without him, I don't think we'd be here this morning. So thank you, Dan. Thank you all for being on the panel. We're here with a distinguished group of individuals who know a lot about oversight, and they know a lot about the IGs. We'll start right to my left, Dan Glickman. Former Secretary of Agriculture and served for 18 years as U.S. Representative from Kansas. Next to him, John McHugh, who served from 1993 to 2009 as a U.S. Representative from New York, and then after that he served as Secretary of the Army. Dave Williams, who has had an extraordinary career as an Inspector General, served most recently as the U.S. Postal Service Inspector General, but prior to that served at the Department of Treasury as the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, at the Social Security Administration, and at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Truly extraordinary number of posts as an Inspector General. And we have an individual who is both a former Inspector General and also a general. General Arnold Fields served 34 years in the United States Marine Corps, and then was appointed in 2008 as the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. Thank you all for being on the panel, and thank you for your efforts in this task force. Let's jump right in. Secretary McHugh, Secretary Glickman, you both have actually been on both sides of this. You served as members of Congress performing oversight over the executive branch, and you've served in the executive branch. And you've, I'm sure, had a lot of interactions with inspectors general in both those roles, and you've probably also seen some of your colleagues get into some trouble with inspectors general. So let's start with you. One of the things the task force found was that inspectors general and agencies need to work more collaboratively rather than adversarially. Secretary McHugh, maybe we can start with you. Why might a department head or an agency leader be hesitant to do that?
Well, one of the quotes that was included in the report was when I said, generally speaking, department heads, agency heads try to keep a distance from an IG because when they show up at your office, it's rather like having the 60 Minutes film crew come to your front door. It's not considered a happy day, and that's unfortunate. Because while clearly IGs are there to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, that's generally not a happy day for an agency head when that happens. But it seems to me that, as Dan had indicated, the drift has gone too far. And what I tried to do, and Dan and I talked about this quite a bit during our panel discussions, was to bring in our Inspector General more closely as part of the management team. Saying in the Army you want to get left of the bang. That means simply you want to get ahead of a problem before it becomes explosive. And IGs can be an invaluable tool for that if they're used wisely. Yes, they have to have their independence, but we tried to make our IG a regular part of the management team just so they were very well aware of what was happening internally. And they have an eye for the kinds of things that most agency heads don't want to see happen, and can be very useful tool in forestalling those kinds of events.
Secretary Glickman, you had, as you told us, a very unique, let's say, relationship with your IG when you started as Secretary of Agriculture. Tell us more about that. Why did it develop in that way, and what was the result?
Well, first of all, thank you for having this. I think this is a really important report that I hope gets implemented both legislatively as well as in practice. So my IG, who became my very good friend, was a beat cop in New York, was the chief auditor for the FBI, and the Inspector General of the Department of Agriculture. So he was no one to mess with. Okay, I came into the Department of Agriculture at a time when my predecessor resigned, in part because of the investigative work done by the IG. So I walked into this department as a member of Congress, as you did, and after, of course, being confirmed, it was strongly suggested to me that the first person I go see is the Inspector General and become his friend. And now it turned out, by the way, that my predecessor at that time, Secretary Espy, was ultimately acquitted of all charges that were brought against him, and now is actually a candidate for the Senate in Mississippi as a Democratic nominee. But besides that point, I decided I had two reasons to go see that IG. One, I did not want to go to the way of that Secretary Espy went, and so I wanted to preserve my own job. Job security was, quite frankly and selfishly, a big part of it. And I wanted
to stay out of jail.
Well, that was implicit because, criminal prosecution was not what I had in mind when I took this cabinet job. And so I talked to him about that case and why did it happen and what I could avoid doing to make sure that I was on his right side. And we worked out an arrangement where we developed a personal arrangement in terms of issues that were going on in the Department of Agriculture. And this is a huge department that does everything from the Forest Service to food stamps to farm programs to food safety. And there were a million problems every day. And so he says, I'll be straight with you if you be straight with me. And so I thought that his advice was very good. And as a result of that, I included him in all my cabinet meetings when I had my senior management team together, because I figured, one, he and his team knew more about program administration than many of the undersecretaries did. And so it was helpful to have him there to hear what was going on. And it was a little bit intimidating at first as people would walk around and see this ex-beat cop there looking at them. But Roger used to bring in donuts and bagels on occasion, and it got to be friendlier as time went on. But I also found him to be extremely helpful in helping me deal with problems. For example, the operation of the food stamp, now the SNAP program, and how to make it more efficient and work better for recipients. And his team helped in the development of the EBT card, which replaced the actual stamp. So he was able to actually help the political and career team who were involved in the various programs do their jobs better. And I think in part that had to do with my personal relationship with him, which is really important for cabinet secretaries and deputy secretaries to have a personal relationship with the IG, work together, be in a position of trust, no surprises. I didn't agree with him a lot. I used to tell him, I said, I don't think you're this, I think you're doing this the wrong way. And he would say, well, I understand it, but I have to do it this way. And he would sometimes talk to me. But I never had a moment like my predecessor did of distrust. And I think it helped the department do much better.
Thank you. Dave Williams, I might ask you from an Inspector General perspective. Obviously, Inspectors General can do a lot to help the agencies improve the management of programs and just their general operations. But both Secretary Glickman and Secretary McHugh have talked about bringing the IG in sort of closer to work in a better, close working relationship. Why might an IG be hesitant to do that, and should they be?
I was part of the initial hiring of IGs all the way back in 1978, and I have a lot of respect for this piece of legislation. And Congress has been great about amending it all along for a very changing world. If you did a word cloud of the IG Act, the big word in that word cloud would be independence. The framers thought that it was hugely important that IGs be independent. They wanted them to be effective. They didn't want them to be directed or misdirected away from the important matters out to the margins of the operations of the department. And they wanted IGs to be credible. They knew that no one would believe an investigation if the investigation was done by the subject of the investigation, someone investigated themselves, or it was conducted by a subordinate inside the organization, or a team player inside the organization. So they wanted the IGs to stand apart. And they also wanted the audits to be the same way. They didn't want departments grading their own papers. All of those were reasons for it. The third thing they wanted was justice at all costs. As Immanuel Kant said, even if the world ends because of it, we want justice. Because living in an unjust world isn't really living. So there was a dedication to that, and sometimes it really wrecks the place. You take out somebody that's essential or really well liked inside the organization. I think as the Washington Post said one time, IGs sometimes pit war against order instead of enforce law and order. When the disaster strikes, which is when you really need everybody, all hands on deck, in theory, the IG is supposed to stand back from that, keep their uniform clean, to come in after it's over and sort of understand what caused it, what might fix it. So they're careful not to get themselves a little bit pregnant in the thing, because they'll end up judging their own work or something that they built. That's a very clean theory. Unfortunately, the world's not a very clean place. It's really messy. And IGs usually, at the end of a major catastrophe, disaster, or opportunity, end up with the same mud and blood and beer everybody else has on them from the department. So that theory is important and has a place, but the real world also is important to respond to. So it either leaves you pristine, this crisp, clean uniform, or you wade in. And if you wade into that, you have to constantly be thinking about that word independence and what it means. And when you wade in, the department has to take a risk too, and it's really risky. In looking at a disaster, you spread out all the pretty things and the ugly things on top of the table to think, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to this? But the alternative is that the IG could come out of this and not really understand what occurred and remain at the margins. So most IGs live with this messy situation with regard to pristine independence, and they live with risk and uncertainty, and they take chances, which is very odd. They're doing all this for the public, and they either don't know them at all or they barely met some of the members, and yet they've been called upon to risk everything. Another messy thing is when you're in the staff meeting and you're investigating people around the table. And there are instances where I've been there days before, hours before they were removed as a result of one of the reports. So this does work. You can develop a very interesting, clean, theoretical model, but it's messier than that. When the Postal Service was one of the agencies recently hacked, a computer intrusion by a foreign intelligence service. The IG actually found, our office actually found it. We found this little beacon. It was sending out this message, I'm set up, I'm assembled, I'm ready to receive assignments. We alerted the Postal Service, but they still needed us for weeks and longer to follow the intruder around, to isolate the parts that have been compromised, and then suddenly one morning to kill it all, including the parts of the system that had been contaminated. That was not very independent of me, but the alternative would have been that the entire system was compromised and we'd have to go into a green field and build it all over again. So the IGs typically are confronted with this dilemma. Am I going to be moralistic or am I going to be moral? Am I going to be theoretical or am I going to, I know where I need to be and I'm going to do it. And I know that that's a world of risk and possible compromise. The IGs were intended to be part of a symbol of a great nation that invites self-criticism, the violence of justice, and continuous improvement. None of those are very fun to do. And part of a nation that wants to get it right more than it wants to look good. And that's not a thing that many nations are capable of. The kind of reports that you see, kind of report that Michael Horowitz put out a couple of weeks ago, in a number of countries would have gotten him killed or run off. So it's great that we have this. It's great that we have a nation that's dedicated to deriving its just powers from the consent of the people. And the IGs are a piece of that legacy and that value proposition.
Thank you, Dave. I'll turn to General Fields. IGs have a unique role in our system. They report to the agency, and they're also expected to report to Congress. So dual reporting sort of relationship can be pretty complicated. And for instance, Congress and the IGs are not always on the same page about what the IG's role is, the priorities or types of things that the IG should be investigating. Certainly Congress quite often tells the IGs what they should be investigating, but they're not always on the same page. There's a little bit of a disconnect. What can be done to try to overcome that to improve executive branch oversight?
Thank you, sir. Let me first say how honored I have been to serve on the task force, and particularly honored to sit here with this distinguished panel, studying a very important and timely subject. Let me preface my response to your question by first establishing my experience as an Inspector General. The office that I was privileged to hold, and still exists actually in someone else's capacity now, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, a new office that the Congress legislated. And we, along with myself, were honored to stand up that office. So we were a little bit different than the normal Inspector General's office. We were virtually an independent agency within the federal establishment. So we did not have some of the leg irons, if you will, where the Inspector General reports to an agency per se, as well as to Congress. Yes, we did report equally, according to the legislation, to the Secretary of Defense and to the Secretary of State. Now, neither one of those folks, I felt, ever got in my way in accomplishing my work. In fact, neither one ever invited me to brief them. I requested to brief them, and they acquiesced to my request, and I was very honored by that. I often state that being an Inspector General and reporting to an agency is like being a family member, and you are a police or highway patrolman, and you pull over your parent in the morning and you issue that parent a ticket for speeding, but in the evening you sit at the dinner table and you have a normal conversation with your parent. That is the challenge, I would say, of being an Inspector General in the normal sense of the 73 federal inspectors general that report to both an agency and to the Congress of the United States. Now, back to your question, how can we deal with it? I would suggest 2 or 3 points. The first of which is the inspectors general are selected from a select group of leaders. And there is an expectation that each one of the inspectors general exercise that leadership, the leadership that had brought them to where they were at the time they were appointed, and the leadership that they exercise in their respective roles as inspectors general. So they need to exercise that leadership both in dealing with their respective agency head and with the Congress of the United States. In the Marine Corps, we have 2 types of expectations when it comes to moral leadership. There is a moral leadership, which means you do the right thing even in the midst of considerable challenge, and to include perhaps even losing your job. And then there is the physical courage. Talking about courage, moral courage, physical courage. The physical courage are those physical things that we are, as military men and women, are expected to do. I am referencing the moral courage that inspectors general need to exercise, especially those that report to an agency, and even that agency invites them to sit at their respective management table. So the first point, exercise the leadership. My second point would say that we need to educate. And this can be a unilateral effort on behalf of an individual inspector general, but it can also be a collective effort that perhaps the SIGI could lead, where there is an interface on a reoccurring basis, perhaps twice a year, semi-annually, with the Congress of the United States. But in between, the day-to-day kind of activity that an individual inspector general and his or her staff might exercise with the staffs on Capitol Hill, as well as the congressmen and women themselves. At times, the Congress will ask an inspector general to do something that's beyond his or her capability or capacity, and might not even be consistent with the expectations of the 1978 Inspectors General Act. So this is where this other element of courage comes into play. The Inspector General needs to have the moral courage to say no, or that this is inconsistent with the legislation, or it is inconsistent with my capacity as an Inspector General. I've testified before Congressman McHugh in my role as Inspector General, and I felt during my testimony that he respected the Inspector General. He made no attempt that I can recall to embarrass me as a witness before his committee. And this is another factor, that an Inspector General is carrying out a very sensitive role with a lot of independence of supporting that role. And I think that the Congress should respect that independence and protect that independence. Otherwise, we lose the reason for which the Inspector Generals were established in the first place. Thank you.
And I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A with the audience. So be thinking of your questions. But I just want to pull on this Congress thread a little more. You know, IGs make many recommendations for agencies of how things could be improved. How can Congress follow up on those and encourage agencies to actually effectuate them? Because that seems to be another problem.
Well, first of all, oversight is perhaps, if it's not the most important thing Congress does, it's near the top. The executive branch has immense powers to do a lot of things. Both John and I have served in the executive branch and the legislative branch. And so there's got to be some belief that oversight is critical. And we have had great overseers in our history, from Chuck Grassley to John Dingell and everybody in between, who made that the core of their function, to make sure Congress did their oversight and the executive branch did things the right way, and politics be damned in most cases. That's being challenged a little bit today, this politics be damned. I mean, damn politics is getting in the way, and too many kinds of oversight situations. The other thing that, as a member of Congress, I felt that we had a couple of champions on our committee. I was on the Agriculture Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and having, not everybody's going to be involved in oversight, but having congressional champions of oversight on every committee is really, really important, like the Grassley and the Dingell example. And the third thing I point out is I was always kind of confused as a member of Congress, although people said that was just part of me, but about the relationship between the GAO and the IG. And I think we're going to do some more GAO-related subjects, but often we would go, let's get the GAO to do this, because they were, of course, an arm of Congress, and the IGs were in the executive branch. And I think that clarity of that is really, really important as Congress looks at things that need to be investigated. But I'll just end by the thing that I'm a big advocate that Article 1 is the Congress, not the executive branch. The Founding Fathers were very clear on that. So if Congress isn't doing its oversight work carefully and thoughtfully, it is not doing the job the Founding Fathers wanted them to do.
I was, and I'm sure the other panelists feel similarly, incredibly impressed by the congressional staffers we had come in and talk to us about their understanding of the kinds of things that Dan just mentioned, the interface between IGs, GAO, et cetera. My experience is that while you absolutely have particular congressional staff who are expert plus in these kinds of activities, and I think the report kind of indicates there's a need to more broadly educate the congressional staff so they can help themselves do a better job of oversight. And we try to, as I said, address some of that factor. As to, Michael, your question on how can Congress help the IGs where you have open findings, which are always a huge problem. I got to the Army, some of the IG recommendations have been open for years with scant, if any, attention at all. And that takes a closer collaboration between the IGs and the members on the Hill themselves. And so what we try to do in this report is encourage that kind of better understanding, to look at the requirements that Congress put on the IGs. Again, in the Army, we had a situation where we did the math. We actually had more mandatory training hours every day than there were hours in the day. So it's probably a good time to kind of relook the kinds of things that Congress has in their required mandated annual reports to see if all are still relevant and necessary. And then at the end of the day, because of that closer collaboration, that better understanding, I think you can help Congress to better oversee the agencies with respect to those open recommendations. Some just become irrelevant over time, but there are many out there that, for whatever reason, lack of attention, lack of understanding by the agencies' heads have not been followed through on. And Congress's oversight role, it seems to me, should include making sure that those things are executed and brought to a conclusion.
Let's go ahead and we'll get ready to turn over to Q&A here from the audience. And we ask if you could say your name and then also be sure that your question is a question, and we'll be happy to get our panelists to answer. Let's go right down here, right up front, right up here to Don.
Thank you. Don Wolfensberger with the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm wondering if there has been a change in investigative versus programmatic oversight over, let's say, the last 20 years. We tend to get the headlines with the wrongdoing, the investigations going on, and so on. Is Congress falling down on programmatic oversight, and to what extent do IGs get involved with both?
I actually think there probably has been a change that occurs from time to time as to whether the emphasis is on fixing or on going after wrongdoing in government. I think they're both extremely important, And in antiquity, there were two views of sin. The Greeks believed that if you committed sin, you were not complete. That's the audit approach. And the Romans believed that you were engaged in evil, and that's the investigative approach. Those have proven to be, I don't know who thought of that, who thought to put those two together for the first time ever, but it was brilliant. And it covers the spectrum of things that we encounter. And both of those tools are very, very important. I wouldn't yield with either.
I don't think you had Greek history in this report. So the only thing I would say is oftentimes the investigative arm leads then to the programmatic changes. So I mentioned the issue of food stamps, multi-billion-dollar program. And there were a lot of cases of, not in the big scheme of things, but a lot of very publicized cases of food stamp fraud, particularly with the smaller retailers. And the IGs did a lot of investigations. There were a lot of criminal cases involved. There were even some with terrorist links. But out of that, then, we were able to make some programmatic changes, including moving to the EBT card and away from the stamps themselves. And in fact, the IGs had a lot to do with helping us design those programs. So the two kind of go together.
Another question. This gentleman right here.
Yeah, Eric Hirschhorn. We have two outstanding IGs here, but sometimes an IG is not as outstanding as the two of you. And I took a quick look at the report. I didn't have a chance to read it fully, but I saw nothing in it about what I found in my experience in two administrations to be the almost complete lack of oversight of inspectors general. And if you have an IG who himself or herself is not up to it, neither Siggy nor the White House nor anybody else nor the Hill seems able to get a handle on that. And I lived through an experience like that. I was not directly involved, but I got to watch it. And I'm disappointed that the report, I guess I need to have a question. Should the report have said something about the lack of oversight of IGs? Thanks.
We do in part, and I think importantly, talk about the responsibility of Congress ensuring that those people selected as IGs are truly qualified pursuant to the 1970 Act. I think you could logically, although the words don't state it specifically, proceed from there and say that you have to make sure that an IG is acting responsibly. It's easy to say there's a lack of oversight of IGs, but I think oversight has to be predicated upon concern and complaint. I mean, you don't want a standing IG investigation committee looking at IGs every day, but if Congress or an agency head gets a report against an IG, then that does need to be followed up and followed through. I can't speak for the rest of the panelists, but I thought that was rather self-evident.
I also think this, again, is a role of the secretary or the head of the department. That's tricky because, you know, that IG may be doing an investigation or programmatic review that directly affects the department at the highest levels. But I felt comfortable telling my IG, you're going down the wrong road on this. And I wasn't particularly worried that he was going to do anything to me. I think, I recall when I was there, we had one cabinet member was in a constant roiling battle with his IG. I won't say who that was, although he is now the governor of the state of New York. But I won't say anything further about it. And I don't know the nature of the circumstances, but I'm sure that had spilled over into the ability of the IG to do his or her job as well as it should, and I'm not sure who was right and who was wrong. But I think that's when you're confirmed to be the head of an agency or department, that's one of your responsibilities. And even though the reporting is to the executive branch and not necessarily directly to you because they have a defined term, there's really no one else who's going to know how things are going inside the department than the secretary or the deputy secretary. And they've got to take that responsibility on. That's why you got to include the IGs in as much as you can in your management team. That way, I think it tends to make it an easier place to manage.
Actually, if I could, that The IG position is actually a very dangerous position. If you look at the history, many have been driven out of their positions. And there is a lot of oversight. From the Secretary, the White House has directly fired several of the IGs, but the press and certainly Congress, our best friends, are also our harshest critics. So it's been a dangerous position. The line that has to remain in place, the thick red line is, you cannot fire an IG on retaliation for their telling the truth. And so there has been a bias against crossing that line. But if we cross that line, I'm not sure there's a reason to have IGs.
General Fields, any thoughts?
Thank you. I will pile on to what Secretary McHugh said about what's in the task force document. There is a reference to this, but probably not at the level of detail, sir, that you are suggesting. But I think on the front end load of the Inspector General process, the selection, nomination, and confirmation and so forth of Inspectors General, that's where the scrutiny should actually take place. And I think there is probably enough in each one of our backgrounds to suggest how successful one is going to be as an Inspector General. But I will tell you, during my tenure as an Inspector General, there was no paucity of oversight from the 6 committees to which the Inspector General, the SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, reports, and a significant degree of oversight, if you will, from the general public. So I think a lot of this is going on, but I understand your point, sir. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one quick last one here. Let's go right up front.
Hi, my name's Elaine Middleman. I'm an attorney in private practice. And I, over the years, have been involved in different cases where I've either made inquiries to the Inspector General. One little agency called the Postal Service was one of them. And also HUD about the Community Development Block Grant funds. I've also reached out to people on this Hill. And I just, either they don't answer me or I never hear back or, they're busy. So I really wonder how these inquiries, unless it's something written up in the Washington Post or something, like, for example, just an example, Secretary Carson spending $31,000 on furniture when in fact there may be billions of dollars at stake that nobody seemed to be caring about in the Community Development Block Grant Funds. So how do the agencies and Congress pick which things they're going to really do oversight on and follow up with?
A little bit of time, so maybe if you each have thoughts or just one or two of you.
Well, so as a political head of a department, and you got a responsibility to talk to your team, and you got to set your priorities. And the IG has to be part of that effort too, to know what those priorities are. But I would say to you that if you weren't getting a response from your IG or somebody in that department, somebody wasn't doing their job somewhere. And so who do you then complain to? Or, well, you, congressman or senator, or you complain to the head of the agency or his or her designee. And I had a couple of cases where people claimed abuse by the IG. And I would come to me and I told my chief of staff, I said, if that ever happens, I don't want you to talk to anybody else except me or our general counsel. And if I viewed it as somewhat serious, I would talk to them about it. So if they're not responding to you, there was a failure in the management system of the organization. And that's the best I can tell you.
I think there's, and we talked about this during our deliberations, there's a lack of bandwidth at times. And I don't mean that to be an excuse. I fully agree with Secretary Glickman. You should have gotten at least the courtesy of a response, and that's not right. But what we do find is that when IGs sit down and try to develop their work program, and in our cases, I think we work together with the IG to point out what our administrative targets were by the time Congress lays down its required reports, et cetera, the available bandwidth from complaints, concerns coming from the outside are severely limited. We do talk about in this report how we could better assign support and assist teams to go to certain, particularly smaller department IGs, which wasn't the case, not the instance in your case. But there is a bandwidth problem, but none of that should excuse a concern, a response, a complaint that goes unaddressed or at least unacknowledged.
Actually, I would say the bandwidth issue is a real one. I think we received about 40,000 hotline calls, in addition to the concerns from employees and the unions and the management associations and the Hill, and then the work that we knew was important to do from our own analysis. Several things can happen from a complaint. They can be looked into and found to not have a basis. They can add to a very important body of knowledge as far as business intelligence for the audit side, or they could result in an investigation. But I think our hotline had sort of 6 people on it. It was one of the big ones, big hotlines. And there do need to be some decisions made with regard to how to spend the resources. They're all too small. All of the IGs are sort of understaffed. And decisions have to be made. Do you staff the IG, or do you staff the program that provides food stamps or whatever service, or in the case of the Postal Service, mail carriers and people that sort the mail. So there is a problem there. There are also a number of things that we receive that turn out not to be true. They were either ill-motivated or misinformed, and we need to conduct that kind of a triage as well.
Okay, I think that's about all our time for this panel. I'd like to thank the panelists for coming today and also for their work on this report. And Robert Shea will moderate our next panel here.
Thank you, Michael. Tough act to follow. If I could ask our panelists to join me. And while they're taking a seat, let me introduce to my left Amelia DeSanto, Deputy Inspector General for the U.S. Department of State and the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Deep experience in this subject. She and I were exchanging war stories in the middle of the last panel. Jim Hughes, on my very far left, former Inspector General at the Social Security Administration and served for many years as an agent of the U.S. Secret Service, rising to the rank of Assistant Director. Beth Stein currently serves as General Counsel for Ranking Member Patty Murray on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And Denise Wilson was a Special Assistant to the President in the Office of Legislative Affairs and a senior member of the legislative team on the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight. So thank you all for joining me and for your contributions to this report. I want to start with a broad, overarching question for all of you. You've been steeped in this for a long time. Give me your perspectives on the evolution of this community, the Inspectors General and their mission since enactment of the Inspector General Act of 1978. Starting with you, Amelia.
Sure. I got involved with the IG community in 1986 when a board of directors looked at me when the DFEs suddenly had to have IGs, and my board of directors looked at me and says, "Go make one." And I said, "What? Make an IG office, just find out what it is and go do it." I said, "Okay." And I found myself at the PCIe ECIE meeting for the first time, and I walked into a large room and there were like 50 people there, and they stopped talking. I walked in. Since that time, I've been very involved with the IG community, also doing oversight of the IG community while I was on Capitol Hill for 16 years. And I'd say over the last number of years, the IG community's gotten a little bit larger, and it's also gotten considerably more diverse over time. And I've watched that diversity, and now I'm part of that diversity. Their interest in being a catalyst for positive change is also a theme that goes throughout the IG community. And then there's also the issue of more enhanced transparency. The fact that you can go to a website, and now we have oversight.gov. You can come right now on the State Department website and you can see all the open recommendations and what the changes every month as far as open recommendations go. I'm even working right now on a virtual SAR that we're trying to introduce so people can have more real-time information regarding our activities. So that's what I've seen over the years.
So I would say that over the time that I have been working with the IG community, there are new pressures on the community because of technology and an enhanced need for speed and coordination. I work for the Help Committee, where we have very large inspector generals and very small ones. And I have seen an increased struggle, particularly for the small ones, to meet the demands that are being imposed on them. And I think that one of the things that this report will help to stimulate is better coordination and addressing some of those challenges.
I think if you look back since the act was first enacted in '78 up till now, you will find that initially the focus seemed to be more on waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think we've taken that, and as David Williams said, it's very important to have that. But I think we're also now focusing on what I call the 3 E's, which was also, it's also included in the original act, and that is to focus and better promote the economy, the efficiency, and the effectiveness of the work that the IGs do toward improving agency operations and also to improve agency performance and also management through management improvements as well. And so I think we are, in addition to embracing the waste, fraud, and abuse, also looking for ways to help agencies improve their operations by taking a look at lessons learned from IG audits and investigation. And I think at the end of the day, that will move us toward a more evidence-based agenda, which I think at the end of the day will also help federal government improve. And that's all based upon how IGs have evolved over the decades.
They certainly have evolved, that's for sure. I think what the report brings out is the absolute necessity to vet candidates for Inspector General very thoroughly, and also looking over the 40 years of IGs, there have been all different kinds. For a period of time, IGs were senior people in government or retired people that came back to the flag, so to speak. And then for a period of time, there was a ration of law enforcement people. Now, today, I think there's a balance in the selection, and the process itself seems to have more analysis, and that's really very, very important. Anyway.
So, Jim, you and I have talked a lot about this. What are the capabilities that you think inspectors general ought to have right now that they don't? More importantly, what capabilities do you foresee over the next 2 or 3 decades that they need to develop to do their job better, to confront the major challenges the government faces today?
Well, I think from what we've already heard, we all know that an IG is a jack of all trades. Really, I mean, that's what the job demands. For you, the IG has to be somebody who understands the world as it is, in the sense that technology has changed many, many things since 1978. So you need to have someone who is committed to all of the requirements and responsibilities of an office of Inspector General. Now, some are more of a law enforcement heavy type because they actually have statutes that they have to monitor and police. And others are more audit focused. So there is no one ideal formula, but I think it's in the vetting and the understanding that the candidate meet the requirements of that particular agency is vital.
So Amelia, add to that. You're in the chair now. What capabilities do you want that you don't have, and do you foresee needing in the future? And then Beth and Denise, you've been on the receiving end of the work. Give us your perspective on that after Amelia goes.
First and foremost, I think the issue of independence, and independence both real and perceived. You have to have real independence, but you also must be perceived as independence, because that can be equally a large problem. I'd say second, about being willing to produce reports that have impact. You want to have impact. You have limited resources, and you want to spend them where they will give you the greatest gain. But I think for capabilities for the future is data, and more data. Knowledge of data analytics and the ability to assess risk so that you know where to put your resources, so you leverage your resources best, I think cannot be overemphasized for today and for the future. And we have to take that data and transform it into information and into evidence. And we need to work better, I think, across offices. I want to take data from another IG or another organization, join it with my data to identify outliers where then I can spend my resources. And I think as far as, the next several decades, that's where the rubber is going to meet the road. The other thing is, I think IGs are the concept of enterprise risk management. And having those offices within IGs, identifying risk within your own organization, particularly because you must ensure the integrity of the information that you have. And what better way to do it is than to have a risk management office within your own office that assesses that for your own organization. So that's what I see for the future for IGs to look forward to.
Beth, Denise?
So I would say that a good IG is a good IG, and that is not something that is going to change, right? It is the person who has the courage to be independent, who's not captured by the agency, but who also doesn't tip into hubris and, is convinced that they know better than the agency, than the secretary, than the career staff. That's a really hard thing to do. There's a lot of people in this room who have done it, and you kind of know it when you see it. With regard to the future, I actually agree that data analytics is definitely where the focus needs to be, but I would actually say also that the IG needs to be pushing the agency. The agencies, in my opinion, are not doing enough to implement data analytics to determine their own risk, and when that can be a good collaboration, I think it can be very successful.
Well, I kind of piggyback on everything, including what the first panel was talking about. But I think in addition to strength and integrity, now we're looking at people who can tell it straight, tell the good with the bad, and also provide solutions so that we can see improvements and also be proactive. I had a really good rapport with one of our IGs in particular, David Williams, who was the IG for the Postal Service. And he had an exceptional guy, Wally Alahovic, who headed his Congressional Affairs Office. And we had detailed, probably weekly discussions on the work of the IG and also where the committee, the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, could assist the IG in doing audits and doing investigations, but also where we could improve programs and also postal management. And so being able to communicate effectively with Congress and be proactive, I think are attributes that we're going to see in greater detail in terms of what the IGs are going to be, the work they're going to be doing with Congress.
So just to piggyback on that, we got a lot of discussion on it in the previous panel, of course, but the relationship with Congress. You talked about having a good legislative affairs person. It's a key post, key capability of inspectors general offices. Talk a little bit more about what's needed to strengthen the relationship between Congress and the inspector general. More importantly, what has tripped them up in the past? What lessons can we learn from where folks have made mistakes?
Well, I think, and I think that was also covered in the first panel as well, IGs really have to have their finger on the pulse. And in order to have their finger on the pulse, either the IG office through the Congressional Affairs or CIGI needs to be in touch with Congress via congressional staff and also important members to educate them as to what the IG office does as opposed to what GAO does, because I think there was, as Dan Glickman said, there's a little bit of confusion at times as to who does what. And so I think the education is key, and also the establishing of rapport with these offices and with the key staff is really, really important. And I think if you're able to keep that touch, that bodes well for your future activities.
Others?
I feel like there is still some reluctance on the part of some IGs to be in regular communication with Congress. I almost feel like in some offices they feel like they might be bothering you. They're not going to,
The inspectors general think they're bothering the Congress by briefing.
Congress is busy, I'm just going to do my work and I'll call when something is done and they need to know. It's not really the best way to do it. I have one agency that asks for collaboration on their work plan. I think that is a very valuable model. I think the other direction, when Congress has the IGs come in regularly to brief not just the committee, but maybe the legislative staff of the committee as a whole, you're building those relationships in a valuable way.
Do you think those relationships are stronger with the oversight committees and not with the authorizing committees, or is it across the board?
Well, doing oversight for an authorizing committee, I encourage them to do more.
Jim?
One of the key points in the report is the organization of the IG community, and this issue with Congress certainly has a lot to do with how effectively the IG community communicates with Congress. There are obviously, there's more focus for IGs than they really have vision for. They're limited by their budgets and people from doing everything that's in the universe of challenges for fraud, waste, and abuse, and the 3 E's. So an IG has to steer through this. And in the report, we speak to the way they are organized and perhaps the opportunity there to perhaps provide SIGI support in a more formal and budgeted way than it exists today. Especially around some of the more difficult areas where we have to keep pace, like cyber issues, IT. Anyway, I think that that's an important part of our report.
Amelia, you're not going to remain silent on this question.
Something that I implemented in our office to ensure that Congress, we're always in front of Congress and not behind Congress. And one thing that we do is that we produce a 2-pager every month. We provide it to our authorizing committees and our oversight committees on the House and Senate. That report, very quick, very easy. These are the reports that went out. These are the reports and audits that we are starting. These are the investigations that have concluded. And this is the status of our return on investment. And here are our open recommendations. We provide that to several hundred individuals every single month so that they know what we're doing. Second thing we do is that we ensure we have a bipartisan, bicameral meeting at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, after the issuance of the semi-annual report, so that people have an opportunity to ask questions, they know what you're doing, they understand what are the trends, and the other thing is the preparation of the management challenges. Preparation of the management challenges is an annual event for the IGs. And those management challenges need to be a thread through the work of the IG community to identify core problems, root causes that, if corrected, will have an incredible impact upon the organization. As far as having some, I came up with tips not to trip. The first one I have is communicate, 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 and then communicate some more with Congress. Second one I have is no surprises. Members don't want to be surprised. If you have a large investigation and it involves a company in a member's district, you want them to know that. You don't want a member to have a microphone put up in front of them and say, what just happened to so-and-so, and they don't know. We can take care of that. And you tell the good with the bad. Next, staff members matter a lot. Don't waste their time and tell them what they don't know. They don't need you telling them what they already know. You need to tell them what they don't know. Next, the Hill has a long memory. Try not to make a mistake, okay?
You mean don't piss them off?
Exactly.
Right, I just want to be,
Exactly.
just a little
they
translation.
They have long memories. Next I have down, trust matters. Trust matters. You need to have respect for the members, and the members have respect for you, and the same holds true with staff, and having good relationships with staff. Next, preempt problems. We live in the world of a whistleblower. Whistleblowers can be an IG staff member, can be an agency staff member. Be upfront with members. If you know whistleblowers coming in or is going to come in, let them know ahead of time, so everybody's on the same wavelength. And last but not least is be bipartisan always. Always be bipartisan on whatever issues that you're dealing with, and that will help keep your IG and the IG community in good stead with Congress.
I think it's to follow on what Amelia has just articulated. All of this and the comments from our first panel, excellent comments, points to the fact that IGs have to be very extraordinary people. And the selection and staffing and recruitment of IGs through the process has to be something that people pay attention to and insist on getting the best people for this particular unique position in government. Today we have vacancies in IGs that have been there for over several years in some cases. And that speaks to issues of politics and and changes in the administrations, but you can't have IGs operating effectively without an IG in place. So I just put that on as a
We have a
tag.
couple minutes for one question, then I want to open it up to the audience. Denise mentioned this explicitly, others have alluded to it, the focus on effectiveness. A program can be beautifully run and be absent any waste, fraud, or abuse, but still not achieving an impact. What is the Inspector General's role in advising Congress and its agency on how to improve the effectiveness of programs, whether to invest in program evaluation or otherwise point its resources in the direction of improving a program's design? Anyone? Yeah, Amelia.
The value of programmatic audits can never be underestimated in identifying ways for an organization to work more efficiently and effectively. The other thing is, several of the IG offices have also now opened Office of Evaluations. And the beauty of an evaluation, separate and apart from an audit, is that you have more leeway. Doing an audit, you are married to the Yellow Book, okay? The Yellow Book controls everything, and you must stay within its parameters, and its parameters are somewhat rigid. In doing an evaluation, you have I can identify a set of criteria, and you have much more flexibility with regard to the nature of the work that you want to do. And that work is often is looking at a particular program. Is it working well? Is it working well with the resources that it has? Is it leveraging those resources? And is it actually accomplishing what it was intended to accomplish? And if not, what do you need to do to make it better? And IGs are doing more and more of that kind of work, in addition to the work of audits, inspections, and evaluations.
Great. Anyone else? Quickly.
So wearing my authorizer hat, I completely agree. And now I'm going to take my authorizer hat off and put my oversight hat on. And I really prefer that the IG spend their resources on the impact investigations and audits that I can't do from where I'm sitting and that I need them to do. So the answer is both.
Just like Congress, right?
It is both, but in a sense, you just described our report, because it points out that the evolution of what IGs are and what they do has to continue. After 40 years, we're still not there yet. And I think we're getting there.
But the nice thing is this has all been covered in the 78 Act, because those 3 E's are part of that act, in addition to waste, fraud, and abuse, and audits and investigations. So I think we're back to the beginning. We're just going to move forward to look at how we can assist management do things better based upon our audits and investigations. So I think that's a good direction to be moving in.
Let's invite our audience to ask the panel some questions. Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Kay Oshel. I'm retired from the Department of Labor. I was wondering, what is the relationship generally between the IGs and the press, and what changes or improvements could be made in that area?
Well, one thing is the press is something IGs have to pay attention to. For example, all of the audit reports that used to be issued by Social Security and sent to Congress and around the executive branch, during the holiday season, you could almost pick that's when those audits would be looked at by the media. And the New York Times, for example, always had a big story on something that probably had been gathering dust for a long time. You have to have someone responsible in your IG organization that keeps a pace with the press and cooperates with them where they can. But that means responding to questions. I think the IGs have to be very careful on the other side of not, of kind of a political use of the media to serve whatever purpose they think is good. But definitely you have to pay attention to the press.
Anyone else? Other questions?
Hi, I'm Wendy Ginsburg with the Partnership for Public Service. And my question, you guys talked about the new skill sets that you're going to need for the forthcoming challenges that face the inspectors general. Do the hiring authorities that exist and the hiring requirements that exist for IGs let you get the talent that you need?
Anyone?
I think right now the ability to hire IT professionals with the level of expertise is somewhat beyond our reach. Their
Generally,
skills,
or because of the hiring authorities?
Generally and because of the hiring authorities, and I should say because of the salary impact and the salary demands that they have. And I think that's something that eventually we will need to deal with, because cybersecurity, information security is so incredibly critical. So I think it does have some limitations on you in those cases.
Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Carolyn Brock, I've managed consulting since '93, and then at the Department of Commerce before that. I have many questions, and I'll ask one. I think I come at this from the perspective of the line manager, lower ranking in the federal government. So when you read a specific IG report, you are often, it's about a specific program, didn't do enough to do such and such on the evaluation side, and not the waste, fraud, and abuse. No claim in the report is about anybody violating the law. But they didn't do enough. It wasn't good enough. You see those reports? It's that perspective from the line manager. So what I was concerned about with the task force is that there's so little input from them, and it wouldn't be possible to get it from an actual manager who is now in an agency saying, here's what it's like from our perspective. But it would be possible to get it from retired SES who have been not at OMB and not in support functions, but have actually managed large programs, to say what kind of skills, what kind of feedback. Would that be possible, I guess, to get that kind of input, or have you already had that?
I think that's a very good question, and as the Bipartisan Policy Center looks for additional sources of remuneration for its work, that's a good line of inquiry it ought to pursue. Just trying to help. But I'd quibble a little bit that we wouldn't be able to get access to current employees. There's no legal barrier to their participation. But I invite the panelists to give their perspective. I think it's an excellent source of inquiry, and it's a good of you to identify that gap.
In terms of getting it now, it's just that they have to go through channels and get clearance from the high level. So
Not necessarily. There are all different ways to skin a cat, as these panelists know.
take a big risk if what you're going to do is react.
Yeah.
And say, I think there were two sides to this story, and my side didn't get told.
Right.
That's a big risk for the line manager.
Yeah.
I think that's really where Amelia was talking about the evaluation reports, that if IGs stick to the just the audit and the investigative reporting, they'll miss what you're talking about. But I think in inspections and in evaluations, there is an opportunity there to perhaps get that input into the document.
Amelia?
Yeah, I think as a general matter, I mean, it's the staff members that, write the audits, that write an inspection, that write an evaluation. And typically, they have a manager. And I do think their stories are told, presuming, of course, that what they write can be independently validated and verified, which is why you'll see in most IG offices, we have indexing and referencing. And it is difficult to put anything in a report that cannot be independently validated and is not evidence-based, because the individual who writes it is the line person, writes that information. That information goes to a third party who is completely unrelated to that underlying report, and every single line is referenced to ensure the integrity of that information. Provided that they write information that is factually accurate and evidence-based, their story is told as they saw it and as they identify it. I should say, as far as the team sees it and identifies it.
Thank you all very much. We're out of time, but greatly appreciate your contributions today and to the report. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Natalia.
Good morning, everybody. First, I'd like to thank Dan Blair and Michael Thorning for the opportunity to work on this project, as well as the rest of the Democracy Project team. Thank you to all the panelists here today. This discussion on why inspectors general matter has been an excellent component to complement to our report. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to the task force members for all of your guidance and contributions throughout this whole process. As we've heard today, inspectors general make a significant contribution to oversight, accountability, and transparency, all essential to maintaining public trust and an effective government. Inspectors general have become a critical part of the checks and balances in our democratic system. Our report, Oversight Matters: What's Next for Inspectors General, provides recommendations to Congress, agency heads, IGs, SIGI, and to the President. These recommendations focus on coordination between Congress and the Inspectors General, independence and the IG relationship, the evolution of the IG community, and growing IG capacity. Collaboration and relationships were recurring themes in our research and in our report. The dual reporting authority for the IGs to report to Congress and to agency heads allows for IGs to relay pertinent oversight information to Congress, but also to support their respective agency missions. Enhancing the collaboration between Congress and the IGs is so important for this oversight function to work well. One of our recommendations is that SIGI should organize regular annual or biannual briefings for members and their staff. Likewise, congressional committees should meet with IGs more regularly to discuss open recommendations, investigation requests, and simply discuss open, important matters that are timely and of great interest. Our recommendations provide suggestions on how to grow and enhance this collaboration. The relationship between IGs and the respective agency heads is also key to oversight function. In our report,